we're rolling, and Richard, away you go.
So I'm always looking at Randy, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, that one off, isn't it?
We're here with Bright Light News. We've been lucky to be invited by MPP Randy Hillier today for an interview. And we just want to start off by asking, you've been the lone maverick politician in Ontario standing up against Ford government's COVID-19 measures. In fact, up until recently, you were the sole politician in Canada questioning the data and science behind government public health policies. When and why did you feel it was necessary to publicly share your concerns within the legislature and on social media?
Well, it's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to be brief here. You know, like everybody else, I think 99.9% of people back in March and even into April were exceptionally concerned and worried and also fearful because of the great uncertainty that was being communicated to everybody, the projections, the apocalyptic models that were being told to us every day and through multiple avenues. Every day it was a relentless. For me, it was around the middle of April I started a live liver transplant. I needed a liver transplant. But the ventilators were designated to be used only for COVID patients and nobody else. And this was a, you know, if I can convey this properly, like that was a constant message that I was hearing all day long, every day. And, you know, I just, whatever this thing called COVID is, this solution that we have is dangerous, right? Exceptionally dangerous. And, you know, and then I just started inquiring independently. And one of the great ironies, one of the great elements of illumination for me was what other respiratory viruses, how do they act? What do they do? What's the consequences of those? But in addition to that, I actually looked at the data from the Diamond Princess.
Right.
Okay. And I thought, well, here's something that can give us evidence because it was a controlled environment. It had no, you know, no transfers of people in and out. It was contained. And although it didn't have a great representation of demographics of society as a whole, it was two very distinct demographics. The old passengers, generally speaking, and the younger crew.
Right.
And one was confined to their cabins, or one had greater confinement. The elderly, the passengers had greater confinement than the crew, because you still have to run the ship, still have to bring the meals, etc. And there was no deaths from the crew, like no crew members, and the infection rate was very, you know, it was very tempered.
Compared to the models, of course.
That's right. And even though we heard all of this doom and gloom from the Diamond Princess, I believe out of 4,000 passengers, it ended up being less than 10 people in total,
right,
who passed away. And I said, okay, well, this, you could not create a controlled trial. You won't be permitted to. But that is, you know, that's a random controlled trial.
right.
The gold standard of scientific inquiry.
Right.
And it says, oh, okay, well, it's not that bad.
Well, would you say that at that time, perhaps leaders didn't have as much information about the virus, and you might give them the benefit of the doubt back in March or April as to the real severity of the virus as compared to the models?
I think the level of fear and the level of misinformation that was being communicated, and just the natural tendencies of bureaucracy and elected people to listen to the experts.
Right.
And listen to their experts, and listen to the experts that they like.
Without looking at the real data.
And there was just an absence of critical thinking.
Right.
You know, it was like, we don't need to think as individuals anymore. All we have to do is listen to our preferred experts. And of course, in every bureaucracy, in every hierarchy, the higher you up, the more authoritative you are.
Right.
Okay? So, you know, Dr. Tam is more authoritative than Dr. Williams in the pecking order. Dr. Williams is more authoritative than the local chief medical officer of health.
Right.
And who is sitting at the top of that hierarchy? And who is the most authoritative? Astonishingly, the WHO. And somebody who is just a scandalous rogue, Tedros.
Right.
So we have a scandalous rogue being the most authoritative, individual in this whole COVID thing.
So when politicians are charged with shaping public policy then, how would you feel that the most, let's say, balanced approach would be other than listening to public health officials?
Well, you know, the most fundamental, the most essential thing anybody should do when they're looking at solving a problem or examining a problem is to be able to think for themselves first.
Right.
Okay? If you can't think for yourself, then go somewhere else.
So would you say then certain considerations weren't taken into account then?
Oh, I think there was a complete absence.
Right.
You know, and even the checks and balances that we have in the system that safeguard against stupidity, you know, generally speaking, and generally they're pretty good. The first safeguard against political stupidity is an opposition that challenges the government and asks questions of the government, makes the government reveal what they know, and then we inform, through that discussion, we inform people, and they use their critical thinking and their judgment and then we also have other added safeguards in there, the committee process to bring in a wide range
Right.
of experts and a wide range of people who will face consequences from those decisions. And
A more holistic approach to.
well, that's the way parliamentary democracy works,
Right.
and we know for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, it's worked damn well. And it has solved, it's been pretty bloody damn good solving problems.
Right.
And with COVID, we said, throw away all that.
So why do you feel we're seeing this more unilateral approach to this single threat?
This is a question many people are asking this. Why did the Western world throw away all our knowledge, throw away all our critical thinking, throw away all our processes, and embraced the communist Chinese authoritarian model as a solution?
Indeed, why?
Why? And, you know, I don't think anybody can answer that question fully at the moment.
Okay.
I think that will take, I think to fully answer it will take many years of prying and digging
Right.
and revealing what was said to who and when and what orders
who.
came out of it.
Yeah.
Because I think when this is all said and done, whenever that may be, and hopefully it happens, and hopefully it happens soon. But there are going to be people who are not going to want their participation in their actions known to the public.
Okay.
Okay? I'm not, that's, and that shouldn't be United States.
Right. Well, shifting away from the more global and unilateral agenda, and coming back to local politics, last week in the legislature, you challenged Premier Ford to uphold his COVID-19 law that limits outdoor social gatherings to 25 people. The next day, you hosted an illegal gathering with more than 150 friends at Queen's Park, away from the legislative precinct where you have privilege and protection as an MPP. Why did you risk getting a $10,000 fine as the event's organizer, and what were you hoping to achieve, and to what end, or what do you think was accomplished?
Well, if I had been charged and if I had been found guilty, it was a minimum $10,000 fine. It could have been higher. It also includes a possibility for incarceration. You know, there's one of the things about non-violent civil disobedience, which is again another critical component of a free society, is that is a way to test the law. Okay? And you have to be prepared for non-violent civil disobedience to work. You also have to be prepared to accept consequences. Right? You know, like criminals don't want to accept consequences, and that's why their actions aren't called civil disobedience.
Right.
They're criminals. Civil disobedience is one of the few mechanisms people actually have within their grasp and within their ability to exercise. And history has shown this throughout the ages. You know, Rosa Parks said, "Okay, I'm not just going to sit at the back of the bus." You know, and Henry David Thoreau said, "No, I'm not going to support slavery, and you can throw the book at me,
Right.
but I'm not going to support slavery." So, you know, and there's many examples throughout history.
Well, that brings me to actually a question. You claim that Premier Ford is merely using COVID-19 laws as a scare tactic. What did you mean by this, as you didn't receive a fine for your illegal gathering in the end? And what does that mean for his laws going forward?
Well, I think we can see his laws are meaningless. They are being used, whether it is to scare people or to coerce obedience to an unlawful statute. You know, however you want to characterize that, but it's not being used in a way such as, you know, a speed limit sign. You know, where you know if it says 80 and you and a cop sees you doing on and running, well, guess what? You're going to get a fine.
Right.
And the cops aren't going to say, well, he's doing only 40 or 50 kilometers over, we'll let him go. No, they'll come after you.
Right.
You know, that's how that gains and builds respect within law. That's part of the rule of law, is that the laws are understood, that there's concurrence and acceptance by society with the law, and that it's also equally applied. And if the law is not applied, then it's not a law. Okay? And if the law is not enforced, it's not a law. So Ford doesn't want anybody to challenge these laws in a court, because I am confident in saying that any court, any competent court will throw the charges out, will acquit. I also think any Crown prosecutor would dismiss the charges before going to trial, because it would be in the public interest to do so.
What do you mean by that? Is that because going to trial might set a precedent that they don't want to set?
Yeah, this is a dangerous path when you're saying our fundamental freedoms of assembly no longer exist.
Right.
Like
And for what time period?
They always must exist. There can never be a time that that freedom is removed. So I think the Crown would also would dismiss the charges. And we saw it again this week with one of Ford's members, Sam Oosterhoff. Not only broke the law, by not having his mask on and maintaining 6 feet and, all these things. And being with 50 people inside and the Premier has said, well, an apology is acceptable. An apology is acceptable. So can you imagine having laws, having the rule of law where it says, oh, well, we just have evidence that you broke into this bank and stole a bunch of money, robbed this person or that person. Would you mind apologizing? The law has to be proportionate. The penalties have to be proportionate.
Right, and equally applied.
And equally applied.
Right.
So, and the Premier has stated unequivocally, I'm going to throw the book at
Right.
people. Now that's a dangerous path as well when the Premier gets to decide how the law will be enforced.
Right.
So, everything he's doing is reactive, poorly thought out, and contradictory to the practices of a functional, competent, and peaceful society.
Right. Well, bringing the topic back to your event at Queen's Park and regarding the mainstream media, we were at your gathering and noticed quite a few discrepancies in the mainstream media's reporting. First, they claimed that your gathering was an anti-mask protest with violence and with only dozens of people. Can you speak to why the media would report your event in such a disingenuous way?
Well, listen, we know there was no mention of masks. I don't think anybody mentioned, there may be somebody mentioned it, but it was, that was not what, it was communicated that this was going to be a gathering of individuals who were like-minded in the promotion of freedom. Right?
Right.
And that there wasn't going to be any protest signs, there wasn't going to be anything. And of course, indeed, we had about 150 people, I didn't count, but by all reasonable, 150, maybe 200, I'm not sure.
But does it seem that they're downplaying the significance?
Sure, and we see that, the media, unfortunately, has been very, how should we say this? Their appetite and their thirst for something controversial and dangerous back in March gave them all an orgasm. That's
So
like
that
this.
excitement hasn't subsided in 7 months.
Well, that's right. This is exciting times if you're in the media. We get to report on one of the greatest catastrophes ever to beset mankind.
Well, would you think it's not as exciting to also cover the other side of the coin? There's a significantly large resistance movement against COVID measures all across Canada now.
Yeah, so professionally, yes, okay. But people who are in that heightened sense of excitement and adrenaline, that's one of the consequences is you don't really think very well, and the media hasn't. But I think that's talking about the media back in March and April, and there's been some progression here.
That's true.
I believe this is true, is that the media, many people in the media now realize that their overexcitement also contributed to the overreaction.
Right.
And I believe there's many people in the media who are now saying, we have to be very thoughtful in how we don't tarnish our own reputations.
While maybe backtracking.
Well, that's right. They're caught in the same pickle as the government. How do they get out of this without looking like absolute fools?
Right.
And how do they get out of this without having liability attached to their actions?
Right.
These are things that governments and the media are doing, and there's other elements as well. There's big tech, and there's you know, there's censorship and disinformation and, you know, like that is happening.
Right.
To protect the narrative, you know, because let's not forget, there's also another big contributing factor is there are lots of people who are profiting very well out of COVID. And whether it's big tech and whether it's big pharma, you know, just think of all the people, mostly white collar, but all like public servants, et cetera, who life is pretty good. You know, I don't have to commute into work, I don't have to drive an hour every morning and every evening in rush hour traffic. I can sit at home. In the summertime, I can go in my pool all day and maybe drink a margarita or.
Do you think that's why perhaps there aren't as many dissenting voices as you would hope, because the comfort level under these measures isn't dramatically affected for every swath of society?
Yeah, no, there's, like I said, some people are not only not equally distributed in the pain, some people are achieving great benefit.
Right.
You know, and you know, and this goes for corporate, the corporate world as well. You know, is Walmart and Costco complaining about this?
Right.
I don't think so.
But then by the same token, there are a number of very large corporations that are unequally harmed by the measures, such as the airline industry. What would you say about about them?
Yeah, there's the way the governments have decided who will be winners and who will be losers.
Yeah.
It's not going to be the marketplace. It's not going to be your endeavors and your motivations and your labors, your efforts. If you happen to be on the wrong side, if you have a gym and not a dance studio, you're euchred. Okay?
Yeah.
Last week in Ontario, if you had a gym or a dance studio, you were euchred.
Right. Fairly arbitrary.
It's arbitrary, and it's ever changing, and it's ever shifting, and people are hoping, you know, maybe if we just be compliant, non-thinking individuals and do what the government tells us what to do, maybe this will all end.
Right.
Well,
there's
I've got a message for you. If you're gonna act like that, if you're gonna be acting as unthinking, obedient individuals, one might argue freedom.
Well,
Yeah.
there is a culture of conformity in Canada in general, and especially in Ontario, where it's difficult to break with the mold in a socially acceptable fashion.
Yeah.
What do you think it's going to take for people to break free and speak out?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. You know, Ontario, especially Ontario, probably more so than most other jurisdictions in Canada, has got a very high level of deference to authority.
Right.
And that's why one of the things we've seen much bigger protests, much bigger rallies against these in Quebec, for example. And certainly out west, there's a far greater, you know, resistance to infringement on the self-reliance and the independence of people. So what's it going to take here? I'm not sure. You know, like, it's really bizarre. A year ago or 10 months ago, if you went and asked 10 people on the street, do you trust government? Right.
Or big pharma.
Well, let's do one at a time.
Yeah.
Do you trust government? Well, 9 out of 10 of them at least would say, are you crazy? Why would I ever trust government? And
so there's this sudden
shift.
Yeah.
And, you know, and again, so we talk about this relentless barrage and of fear. So, but, you know, by April, if you went out and asked 10 people on the street, how do you trust government? You know, 9 of them would say, oh yes, they're saviors.
Right.
You know, they're the second coming. And, well, what happened? What happened in that interlude?
Right.
And I'm not fully certain of that. I know I didn't change my position.
Right.
You
There
know,
was some.
I was still that one, you know, I would have been that one, part of the 9 in the first part and the 1 in the second part. Like I've seen government, I know how they operate. And,
Yeah. But the psychological effects of fear would definitely play a role in terms of
Yeah, and
society's behavior.
yeah, well, without a doubt, you know, and we know one of the elements of fear. Like fear is supposed to be something that's momentary in its nature, right?
Right.
Like it should only happen for an instant.
As a necessary response.
As a necessary response to a credible and apparent danger,
Right.
right? And I've told this story to others, like, you know, I haven't felt fear for a long time. You know, when I was a little kid with nightmares, sure. But, you know, in the last time I recall being fearful was I was out fishing in a very and I was with 2 buddies, and from one lake to another lake through the bush.
This is a very Canadian story.
Oh, and well, we came across a bear, and the bear came across us, and both the bear and us took off in 2 different directions.
Right.
We were both scared, you know what.
An immediate response.
Yeah, it was, okay, drop everything, let's run, and run fast. And thankfully the bear did the same thing.
Right.
So, you know, but within a couple minutes, within 5 minutes, within 10 minutes, okay, the adrenaline was coming down.
Right. The fear subsides.
We've stopped doing this, and we get composed again, we think. And we said, okay, you know, we're not the bear. We can probably walk back to that other lake now and go fishing.
Right.
And we did.
And you move forward.
Yeah. And I've never been fearful of going in the bush.
Right. It didn't change your life dramatically.
That's right.
It was more in the moment.
But can you imagine if you were in that state for a day,
Yeah.
for 2,
For 7 months.
for months?
Yeah.
Like, holy Jesus, you're, you know, and we've seen, I think we've seen this, evidence of this, is some people you just can't speak to now. Like it has become so polarized.
Right.
That with all the evidence, all the data presented in a thoughtful and calm manner, it's
Right.
it's just, this, and I think there's a, you know, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not, you know, a medical expert, but I've seen this really disturbed change in so many people in society. You know, where we have families who won't, the divisions within families,
Right.
where brothers and sisters will not permit one to come to the other, or
It seems that many are downplaying the evidence that opposing views are supplying.
yeah.
Why do you think there's this immediate dismissal of credible evidence from credible scientists and credible sources all over the world as either falling into categories of conspiracy or otherwise?
Well, you know, I think it's like this. You know, the level of terror and the level of fear has put everybody in just a highly charged emotional state.
Right.
Right? And listen, emotions are an important part of our decision-making ability.
So you might shut something out immediately, regardless of the source, just because you're in this state of rejection.
But if you're only looking at things through this emotional state,
Right.
you know, like we know, we have to use our heads, we have to use our logic, we have to
Right.
use our reason, and we have to use our heart, we have to have compassion and understanding and empathy when we make decisions. That's how human beings operate.
Right.
But if you're only seeing things through that state of fear,
It's difficult to come up with rational outcomes.
That's right, and if you've been living like that for now months on edge, how easy is it for you to say to yourself, I was bloody duped?
Yeah.
You know, how easy, no, and I'm saying, like, you know, everything that I fundamentally knew for the last 5 or 6 months is wrong,
Right.
you know? Like, you have to be a big person to be able to admit you're wrong for that long.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like, you know, again, not that I'm a medical expert or something, but it looks like something akin to when you deprogram somebody out of a cult,
Right.
right? Like, you know, we
That's
know.
what it's going to take, you mean?
Well, yeah, it's sort of the similar attributes here. You know, you can't just go take somebody out of a cult of Jonestown or, you know, or Waco or whatever, take them out and expect them to be normal.
Right.
Right? You know that there's a process to get these people back into being, you know, to using all their faculties.
Right.
I think it's something like that.
Well, there does seem to be an apparent push
Yeah.
to go towards something of a new normal and not to ever return to that state of individuality and critical thinking and all those things that we
Yeah.
hold dear. Do you see that happening with your constituents in Ontario?
Well, listen, I represent a very rural area. You know, the biggest urban area in my riding is 10,000 people. So, you know, there's different characteristics there. You know, we don't have public transit, we don't
Right.
have.
Do they need to
highways.
go towards any kind of a different normal, really,
It-
in that setting?
Well, the preponderance of people in my riding, I would say, share my views
Okay.
on COVID. Maybe not a majority, but a significant number. And, you know, and for those people, you know, any talk of a new normal is bullshit. Right? And I agree, because we can't tell what this new normal would actually be.
Right.
Like, because as we've seen through this last 8 months, everything is always shifting, everything is always fluid, everything is always contradictory. You know, there's no stability, there's no certainty. And, you know, that would be a consequence. If,
Right.
and if you obedient and not exercise personal judgment.
Or in a sense, give up the responsibility to a higher authority.
To an authority that is not as competent as yourself.
Right. Understood. Well, just circling back to the legislature here, you've been the leading dissenting voice to the Ford government. You've supported your arguments with expert testimonials, for example, on the high false positive rate of the PCR testing method. You've shared a letter from your public health unit explaining that the decision for mandatory masks in your region, Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston, was not based on science, but rather a public opinion poll. You've presented epidemiological data on the severity of COVID-19 or the lack thereof, and you've even interviewed doctors and scientists. With such credible data and expertise supporting your claims, why have you been silenced during question period in the Legislative Assembly and even painted as a conspiracy theorist by the media?
Yeah. Yeah, but again, this goes, you know, this is one of the things that we know that we've embraced over the decades in Western society. That, you know, we've adopted the mantra and the dogma of political correctness. We've adopted the mantra of compelled speech.
Right.
There's a great number of people who believe that it's better not to have a dissenting opinion than to have facts. Right? Like,
The
you know,
compulsion of conformity, in a sense.
and yeah, that's right. You know, so, and anybody who speaks out in the alternative, in the dissenting view, look what they did to Jordan Peterson when he had a dissenting view, and there's somebody who is exceptionally well-read, somebody
Right.
who is exceptionally knowledgeable.
And in fairness, he's gained a great deal of popularity since.
Well, that's right,
his
but here's somebody whose intellectual abilities, you know, stands head and shoulders above
Right.
the people calling them evil, terrible things.
Yeah.
And, you know, so, like, you know, I admire people who are smart.
Right.
I want to listen to people who are smarter.
Yeah.
And I want to engage with them. But in much of society, much of the media, in much of the political apparatus, engagement is dangerous.
Right. So, well, then speaking of, yeah,
Give me 1 sec.
sure.
The sun's just poking onto your face there,
Oh, is that right?
Randy, and it's over.
Great conversation. Really
Yeah.
appreciate it. It's good. Good.
Well, I think this, you know, people need to have a little bit more time for themselves
Yeah.
to be engaged and to have discussions.
Right. And we're missing
And
one.
not just these, you know, 20-second, 30-second.
Exactly. Yeah. That's
you know,
why we
being
appreciate
here
it.
and, you know, jingle ears.
Well, and I'm just going to bring this back to talking about dissent. You ready?
Mhm.
Okay. So just circling back to that issue of dissent, just recently, 5 Halton politicians, including 2 of the Premier's own MPPs, successfully spoke out against further restrictions in their region in a letter to Ontario's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. David Williams. Why do you think they spoke up now? And do you feel that there are other MPPs who disagree with the measures but perhaps aren't speaking out?
Oh, I know there are. And
Would you
good,
agree with them?
good on them. Good on those people who have spoken out and who have gone public in their opposition. This is we've distorted many things during COVID, but one of the greatest distortions that has happened is, and I think this is because Doug Ford just doesn't know it any better. You know, I don't think it's evil or malevolent.
Right.
You know, I think he just is not very smart about this.
He's following direction.
Well, he said at the beginning of this outbreak, he said, I am going to rely on David Williams to make the decisions.
Okay.
Right? Well, the Premier is the Premier. The Premier is who's elected, not David Williams.
Right. The Premier has to take into account all views.
Well, you should be taking in advice from public health, from private health. You should be taking in advice from economic advisors, from mental health advisors. Like, there's all kinds of people. When you make a policy for 15 million people, there's a lot of different perspectives that you have to understand.
Yeah.
Okay? And to narrow it down to a myopic, singular view of a public health bureaucrat was stupid.
Right.
There's no other word to say that. But,
Short-sighted maybe.
well, no, it was a great display of incompetence.
Right. Okay.
But he thought it would give him political cover, okay, and that
Right.
he wouldn't be responsible. And then the Premier wouldn't be held responsible.
Right.
Okay?
By
So,
deference.
I did what the Chief Medical Officer of Health
Yeah.
suggested.
Yeah.
So he's demanded that there be no daylight. And he even said this, he said, the cabinet will discuss and debate, but David Williams will decide.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
To again further cement this non-responsibility.
Well, is that sort of a suspension of parliamentary process? then?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
You know, it's a fundamental, like, that's an embrace of communist process. I
Right.
think that's,
Okay.
so these people knew that if they wanted to get Ford to change any laws about the lockdowns in their areas, the one that they had to convince was Dr. David Williams.
Right. Okay.
And that's why elected MPPs, elected representatives, thought it more important to go to the medical officer of health than it was to their own premier
Right.
to change the laws of Ontario.
Right.
So just keep that in mind now.
Yeah.
A medical officer of health is making the laws.
Right.
Right?
So we've also noticed there's a lot of shift in terms of those very regulations. And since the beginning of the COVID outbreak in March, it seems the government's been shifting the goalposts in terms of when Ontario can reopen. The original goal of not overwhelming our healthcare was met, as even during the peak of infection, hospital capacity here never reached more than 64%. The current goal seems to be the eradication of every last case, but as time goes on, consequences of the health and livelihoods of Ontarians seems to be mounting in costs, lives, and frustration. Can you share some of your concerns on the collateral damage of the Ford government's measures and those of your constituents specifically?
It will take years to compile
And measure.
consequences and measure and understand the depth of harm and hurt that we've created. You know, where to begin with that?
It's very broad.
Yeah, but well, let's take the first part of the question.
Right. The goal.
We met the objective.
Right.
We met the objective early, we met it with spades, okay? We have, at the time, we had 37,000 beds in our hospital system in Ontario. The single greatest number of COVID patients, or people with COVID in our hospitals, was 1,300.
Right.
Okay, so a pretty small sliver.
Right.
And yes, the hospital capacity, the utilization rate in our hospitals, it varied from hospital to hospital, but average was about 60%.
Right.
So we were paying for all that hospital capacity, all those tens of thousands of beds that
Right.
weren't being
In
used.
prevention.
The public was paying for it,
Yes.
but they weren't getting any benefit from it.
Right.
And we know, just in that short period of time from March to June, we know that there was 1,100 fewer cardiac surgeries.
Right.
We know that there was at least 200,000 needed medical procedures not done,
Right.
including 200 organ transplants.
Right.
Right? Those are things that we do know, but there's a lot we don't know.
Right.
And we don't even know what we don't know what it is.
Right. Which we'll come to find out as time goes on.
That's right, we will find out, that will be revealed in time, hopefully. But, at the height, in Canada, we had over 12 million people either unemployed or on government
Subsidy programs.
subsidies. And that's out of a workforce of about 17 million people.
Right.
Okay, and what's going to be the consequence? Like we've just demonstrated to millions and millions of people in Canada that we will incent you not to work.
Yeah, well, that actually brings me to a question about the federal government. As many have pointed out, they've provided these subsidy programs for individuals and businesses to lessen the economic impacts of COVID-19 lockdown measures. Do you feel that they've then been adequate in addressing the concerns of business owners and laid off workers? And do you feel that the government has the capacity to even take on such debt? How will this ultimately impact the Canadian taxpayer?
Well, listen, however bad and distorted and foolhardy and problematic the provincial decision making were, encouraged stupid behavior from our provincial premiers by hanging out and dangling bags of money
Free money.
to do what Trudeau wanted them to do, and he wanted them to shut down. And we can also say that Trudeau was absolutely, his behavior borders on criminal as well. We know, as we were saying, the land border with the United States has to be closed. We're going to continue to allow planes flying in. Well, how can you do that? How can that be logical? Well, it isn't.
Right.
Okay, we still have it's unlawful to have 10 people in your house in Ontario, but you can have 200 people in an airplane landing in Toronto.
Right, in close quarters for
You
several
can have
hours.
much closer quarters than in your home.
Right,
You know, and masks won't do you any good. Don't wear a mask, you know, Dr. Tam. Well, masks are good.
right,
And of course, this juvenile and bizarre stuff about, if you're having sex with somebody, make sure you don't kiss and wear a mask.
right,
And, and you go to the solo sex,
Right.
okay, well, it's a new term on me, I'm a little bit old, I know. What are we doing? Are we, has Canada, discovered by assholes now? And I say that, these are not what rational people would say it's not what I expect rational people to say is, the cure for COVID is to engage in solo sex and be contradictory, and we do.
right,
And, if we close the borders, we might be seen to be racist. Wow, where did that come from?
right,
Is this a danger? Was it a danger? And if it is a danger and we want to limit spread and we're going to close the border with the United States, we have to close our airports.
right,
And I don't care if you call me a racist because I've closed the borders and the airports.
right,
That's just bizarre thinking.
yeah,
And how did people buy this storyline?
right, and the consistency that's lacking between policies.
Well, it's just absolutely contradictory.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, my last question to you then would be, going forward, how do you propose that Ontarians move past the restrictive COVID-19 measures that are limiting people's rights to earn a livelihood?
Well, we just have to recognize the fact, okay, that this is there are some important distinctions that we know to be true, okay? This virus will, is more severe for the elderly than the regular flu. Yeah. That's true.
Right,
We also know that it is far less dangerous to everybody else,
right,
okay? So there's a starting point. Understand who's at risk and what is the risk? Is it high? Is it medium? Is it low? Is it zero?
right,
And convey that to people. And then we also know that its transmission is not through picking up a paper
Right.
somebody else that you touched.
yeah,
Okay, that's not how it's transmitted. We know that it's transmitted inside, in confined quarters, with close proximity to one another for extended periods of time.
right.
Okay, so a casual walk by,
Not
that
very
you're
much.
not.
Right. But the narrative has shifted a little bit now.
A little bit.
And the science seems to be constantly evolving for some reason.
Well, the narrative keeps changing, but
Right.
the science doesn't.
Right,
Okay,
well, now
the
they're
evidence,
shifting,
the evidence is pretty clear now.
right, but the focus has been shifting now towards long haulers with
Yeah.
COVID, rather than necessarily mortality. We're looking at
Another
morbidity.
spin label, another spin label. So listen, we should be working to diminish the resident load in our long-term care, okay?
Right,
Where there was 4 people to a room, we should be trying to get that down to, 2 less than 4.
right. Of course, the vast majority of mortality
Sure.
with COVID-19 was in long-term.
2/3 of it here, and worldwide about 80%.
Right,
So let's look, what can we do in our long-term care homes,
right,
okay? That would be a big help. But we also know, get the people in long-term care wherever possible outside more often,
right,
okay? Because it's inside, in confined spaces, with prolonged in close contact. So,
Precisely the opposite of what should be prescribed for their health and well-being.
well, that's right, but exactly what we exasperated
Right,
during COVID. So wherever possible, get people who are vulnerable outside, be physical, have some activity, but also maintain distances.
right,
Okay. You know, that would be a big thing. For people who are, you know, healthy and young, let life go on.
right,
And just, you know, that's not being, that's just what the evidence tells us that we should be doing.
right,
We should be reopening our hospitals. You might want to have some protocols in there, so, but not go over the top where we can't even utilize our healthcare system anymore. You know, if you present at the hospital, because that whole story about the asymptomatic spread is also found to be BS.
right, limited.
Very, like, so if somebody presents at the hospital with that is sneezing and coughing and running the temperature, okay, then you say that there's somebody that we need to treat a little bit differently
Right,
than the who's,
at no risk at all
yeah,
at this point.
you know, or who broke their arm or something like, you know.
Right.
And we should only be testing symptomatic people.
Right,
And we should be dropping our cycle thresholds down into a moderate and somewhat agreeable, can have at least some probability that we're not just going to get false positives.
right, right, understand.
You know, because, you know, that whole false positive stuff is just, that's what the governments are using to continue to drive this overreaction.
Right,
You know, and we know, like, in Ontario, the deputy chief medical officer, Barbara Yaffe, said we have a 1% error rate. And a lot of people don't, okay. She said it's a 1% error rate that leads to 50% false positives.
right,
Okay,
that's the more important figure.
how does that work, even
Yeah.
on a basic level? But the 1% error rate applies to all the tests that are done
Exactly,
in a day. Okay, so if you do 50,000 tests today, 5,000 are going to be false.
right,
Okay?
500, that's.
Oh,
yeah,
500, pardon me.
yeah,
500 are going to be false.
yeah,
Okay, you know, so when they say, you know, we did 50,000 tests and we got 1,000
yeah,
positive results, well, then we should be saying, okay, well, we know 500 that we're going to be wrong.
right, right.
And we should be saying,
Especially outside the context of symptoms.
well, that's right.
I mean, if there's an absence of all symptoms,
So-
what does the positive test really mean?
Well,
Are you contagious?
Well,
Are
we
you
know, the premier has said himself, about 80%, this is what he has said,
Right,
okay? He has said about 80% of people with, who test positive have no
Right.
symptoms.
right,
Okay? And I'm just from the old school. If I feel well, if I don't have any sicknesses, if I'm not, then I am well. You know, if I don't have any bad symptoms, if I'm not feeling ill,
right,
that means I'm healthy.
right.
You
Your
know,
body's not.
and
like
even if somebody
overloaded.
tests me and says, well, you should be sick.
Right, because we found a trace. We found a trace of the
Yeah.
virus or something.
No, so, you know, like, why are we doing what we know is wrong?
That's a great question. Well, on that, I'd like to thank you very much for welcoming us and for this very pleasant discussion. On behalf of Bright Light News, I'm Richard Gerges. We're with Randy Hillier. And
Richard,
it's been a great pleasure.
It's been a pleasure chatting, and we'll have to do it again another time.
I hope so.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Cut, that's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
But we need to do one thing. Apparently 13 people died on the Diamond Princess, so can you, we're just gonna have you restate that.
Oh,
Okay, I said, didn't I say about 10?
You said 10.
You said specifically 10.
Oh, did I? I thought I
It's
said.
just people will fact check you like I did.
Yeah.
We can also just redo the intro, just real quick.
Yes, I would highly recommend redoing the
Yeah,
intro.
I wasn't really into it yet.
You were, no, well, you were nervous. Now you're more
Yeah.
at ease.
I was, yeah, right.
Right, okay, we'll finish that and then Stefan is here and then we'll say hi to
So,
Stefan.
yeah, how am I gonna remember exactly what I said about the Diamond Princess?
All we need you to say, because we'll cut it into a close-up of you, is, well, we know that on the Diamond Princess, only 13 people died.
Okay.
One sentence.
Hey, what did they do? They threw them overboard or
I
something?
think they
As
executed.
soon as they heard they had COVID,
No autopsy.
Okay, you wanna do that first?
Why don't we get that out of the way?
yeah,
Sure.
So we
I
know,
didn't know exactly how it was, I said.
not to worry, not to worry.
He'll focus on just your face.
Yeah, we got lots of angles, Randy.
Yeah.
Okay.
The magic of.
So looking at Richard, Randy,
Yeah.
so we know that just one sentence was cover us. Okay, go ahead.
And we know on the Diamond Princess, 13 people died out of 4,000.
Right.
Like you're a politician.
All right, so just the intro, let me just get this straight
It's
here.
really 213, but we're gonna say that.
Maybe instead of saying that he's from Lanark Friendly at Kingston, let him say that instead.
I don't know what.
No, just like I'm with MPP Randy Hillier, and then let him introduce himself, and then yeah,
Okay.
that type of thing. Like you introduce you as Richard Gerges with Bright Light News, and then I'm with Randy Hillier, and then Randy Hillier can say a little bit about himself.
Okay, so for Bright Light News, I'm Richard Gerges, and I'm here with MPP Randy Hillier. Would you like to introduce yourself to Canada?
Great to meet you, Richard, and I'm the independent member of the Ontario Provincial Parliament for the riding of Lanark, Frontenac, and Kingston.
Terrific. Good enough.
Don't cut. I gotta do a sync mark again.
Oh, right, yeah.